Welcome back, students. This is the week 4 highlights for English 12B. We're going to take a look at a few things this week, including the keyword main idea graphic organizer. We're going to show you how we use it to take a lot of information, such as a large essay or a page that you might be reading, and how to develop in a very short process a summary of just one sentence of the information that we have in the item that we're looking at. We're also going to take a look at the Victorian era. This is the second part that we're going to take a look at. Following that, we're going to take a look at one of the big time authors from these Victorian era gentlemen that many of you know by the name of Charles Dickens. Wrote lots of books. One of the more famous that you hear in the winter time would be that of The Christmas Carol. But Charles Dickens is more than that, and we'll take a look at him as well. This is the week 4 highlights. Let's begin with our inference lesson of the day. Using a keyword main idea graphic organizer is very helpful when you have large amounts of information and you need to gather facts or to summarize the information that is found in either a paragraph, an essay, or even a page of text. In our inference text, we had the following question that we had to summarize. And basically, it stated shopping malls have produced a revolution in the United States shopping and living habits in just 45 years. Before 1950, there were no malls, but now almost every city or region has at least one. In fact, shopping malls have become a part of daily life. Many people even think of them as social centers. In a way, malls have taken the place of Main Street. Shops and services, which were once spread over several city blocks, are now in one place at the mall. Busy householders can save time by doing their shopping at the mall. And people, young and old, with time on their hands, often say, "Let's go to the mall." So, how do we summarize all this in one sentence? Well, let's look at how this graphic organizer works. First of all, if we were using this to take notes within a course, we want to make certain that we have an idea of what we're talking about. Okay, if we're reading a particular book, maybe it's page 47 that we would list as section. In this case, we're talking about shopping malls. What are some of the keywords that we see there? Well, one of them is daily life. Shopping malls are here in our daily lives. Another one, if we look at it, is that they are social centers. And busy households love malls. That's a key word. If we didn't have busy households, would we be going to the mall? We wouldn't really have to go to the store often. But those aren't all the keywords or main ideas. We can't just lump them into one. We got to know what the main idea is, and we know that before 1950 there were no malls. Actually, the first mall is just a little bit to the west of Minneapolis proper. Featured in a few different shows. Being the first enclosed mall has its advantages, especially in Minnesota. I mean, who wants to go shopping outside when it's cold? And by enclosing it and building these items that are malls, or to be out of the rain even, this idea took hold. Because before 1950 there were none, and now every city and region has one. Remember a while back I was up in Grand Rapids, Minnesota, a small town. They still had a mall. It wasn't the size of Mall of America, mind you, but it did work and it did have stores enclosed in one area. And malls, remember, take the place of Main Street. Okay, people used to go down to Main Street and you see all these stores on the main street of town. Now, if you go on a main street in some towns, you see just office buildings, especially the larger ones. St. Paul used to have downtown stores. Now, what they don't have Macy's. You don't see that in downtown St. Paul. What you see is office buildings. So, looking at all this information, there's still one question I have. Okay? And that question is, if no malls before 1940, an article says in the last 45 years, is this information important in 1995 or 2015? Well, looking at the paragraph, it really doesn't matter, but it does matter that we question what we read. And good readers will ask questions about what they have read. So, what have we read? Can we put it in a sentence? Can we say daily life, social centers, busy households? Can we reflect on these main ideas of before 1950, no malls, and every city region has one, and it takes place on Main Street? Yes, we can. This is how we can look at it. In just 45 years, shopping malls have become a part of everyday life, replacing Main Street as a social center and offering a convenience to busy households. About the only thing that's missing here in this sentence is a period. And do we really need to say every city or region has one? I think it's safe to assume, especially when we say shopping malls have become a part of everyday life, replacing Main Street. Everyone has a Main Street. So, there you go. Here is a way to understand information, how to summarize it in a sentence. And you can use a keyword main idea graphic organizer for it. It works great for factual information. It works great when you are looking at novels and you're trying to take a look at a scene. Act 1, Scene 1. What is it all about? What were some of the key items, main ideas? What's one question you have after seeing the action that has taken place? And how do you summarize what you just read? Keyword Main Idea Graphic Organizer is a great tool to help you understand. Now, enough with the graphic organizer. Let's take a look at a couple items where you can use this Keyword Main Idea Graphic Organizer this week. First, beginning with part 2 of the Victorian era. Previously, we discussed how the Victorians were basically not only the age of the reign of Queen Victoria, but also a change in the world. A change from an agrarian society, which is more like your farms, your agriculture, to that of an industrial society. The key that we find during the Victorian age and with Victorian literature is that authors are going to address society's concerns over industrialization and religion. You see, in the 1800s, a lot was going on, especially in the area of religion. You had Charles Darwin, whose new theories were completely opposite of what the religious institutions had previously taught. You had a couple different movements. One of them, the Romanticism movement, or the Romantics, that was just a period that had just finished, but there were still people that believed in that ideal. That remained popular, as well as realism. Okay, realists wanted to portray human life like it was. Okay, they rejected all this heavy symbolism. Okay, naturalism was basically people saw uh, an even harsher attitude because they were influenced by Darwin. They looked at nature as being indifferent to how humans suffer. And then there was a counter movement, and that was called the Pre Raphaelite Brotherhood, or PRB. And they had a very romantic view of nature. They found it to be inspirational and bring in peace to them in their lives. They were the innovators, especially in the way artists were perceived and how art was conceived. One of the gentlemen, one of the authors that was influenced by this movement was Oscar Wilde, who was very prolific towards the end of the 1800s. So influence occurred throughout. Now, one of the influential authors that you're going to come across is Elizabeth Barrett Browning. And she looked at the social concern. She looked at how slaves were being treated in America and how the Italians were being treated by Austria. You see, Italy didn't exist as a country. It was pretty much governed by Austria. And then you also had child labor, and women really didn't have many rights at the time either. And she really looked at these. She had a controlling father, and he didn't want any of his kids to marry, but Elizabeth Barrett Browning, at that time known as Elizabeth Barrett, ran off with another writer by the name of Robert Browning. They went to Italy. They got married. She had a son there. She wrote and started to have a lot of her poems published now that she was in Italy or in the Italian era. One of her famous ones is from Sonnets from the Portuguese, and Robert Browning, looked at Elizabeth Barrett Browning as his little Portuguese, and so that's where we get the title from. And she writes in the Italian sonnet or Petrarchian sonnet form, where you have the octave, which tells us about the theme, and then the sestet develops that theme and gives us more information about it. Expresses that intensity, if you will. And their most famous sonnet is Sonnet 43, and it goes like this. How do I love thee? Let me count the ways. I love thee to the depth and breadth and height my soul can reach, when feeling out of sight for the ends of being and ideal grace. I love thee to the level of yesterday's most quiet need, by sun and candlelight. I love thee freely as men strive for right. I love thee purely as they turn from praise. I love thee with the passion put to use in my old griefs and with my childhood's faith. I love thee with a love I seem to lose with my lost saints. I love thee with the breath, smiles, tears of all my life. And if God choose, I shall but love thee better after death. It's a real love story that is happening there. And as you listen, it's very emotional. And, you hear that rhythm. There's a repetition of words. I love thee, I love thee, I love thee. Wants to really get the point across that she's in love. Now, her husband, whom she was in love with, was Robert Browning. They met about in the 1840s, about 1845. And it wasn't until they moved to Italy that everything started going well for both of them. Robert Browning was greatly influenced by Percy B. Shelley. Shelley, we've heard of earlier in the course. Okay, and he wrote very much just like Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and he used iambic pentameter. He used dramatic monologue, which is what you would see with Shakespeare and some of the other great artists earlier on. And dramatic monologue, what it would do is it would take the end of the line, instead of having punctuation, we would have enjambment, where you had to read the next line to understand what that line was saying. He would write very conversational and informal tone, and his couplets would rhyme. Okay? Now, along with him, another author who had a strong social conscience was a gentleman by the name of Matthew Arnold. And he was a very controversial figure because not only did he, you know, refer to the upper class as Philistines, um, he also was critical of the middle class. And that did not sit well at that time. Dover Beach looks at a various amount of themes. It uses the calmness of the seascape at night, while then just a little bit while later, it talks about the grating roar of the waves. He will use the sea as a metaphor for faith, and the sea represents the sense of a religious doubt. And this was occurring because Darwin came out at this time and was talking about how there was a natural selection, that heredity is what causes the changes, that we evolved as man and as woman. So, you have some great poets. You also have some good novels. Okay, they would use a complex plot, and you'd have major and minor characters, and there would be one overall theme that would have them. And a lot of times, the people that were reading them, and what they didn't want, didn't want the wealthy aristocrat. They wanted more common, everyday people, people that they could identify with. And what they would do is they would publish these novels in newspapers. And the example then for what would be today type or style, you could look at it as a television sitcom. You know, every week people would clamor for these new scenes or acts or chapters as they were being published in the newspapers. And newspapers were at their largest circulation at this time. Everyone read the newspaper. Probably the most influential is Charles Dickens, and we will hear more about his vivid storytelling and humor and empathy and irony, his keen observations of people and places, and sharp social criticism. And yes, his characters would be unique and eccentric, to say the least. You have other novelists, including the Bronte sisters, Emily, Charlotte, and Anne. And there were many women who were publishing novels about that time. Unfortunately, many of them were in using male pseudonyms, because people still didn't treat women the way they are treated today, as an equal. So, let's jump ahead and take a look at the most influential author of the day. Let's take a look at Charles Dickens. Okay, so as I have said before, the Industrial Revolution is ongoing at this time. And the Industrial Revolution causes a couple of things to occur in British society, and that's the class system and the growth of those class systems. You see, people used to be farmers, but now they were looking for work. So what they did is they traveled to the cities because there were factories there, and they had great opportunities um, for work. Okay. You started seeing though the farms that did exist were becoming large collectives, and you'd actually have less and less farmers, but they owned more and more land. And the small farmers were basically squeezed out. A lot of inventions were going on during that time, especially as a result of the mechanization of industry. And what you see is the Cotton Gin by Eli Whitney, and that what that basically does, instead of having 8 workers, you only need one. So it's saving costs. And the South had a lot of cotton, and so they used this cotton gin. And so other things would revolve around it. You got a spinning jenny, where this was a device that would help spin the yarn. And you'd get power looms. So instead of a person doing it by hand and making a carpet, or making a type of cloth or fabric, whatever you needed woven, now you had a machine doing it. And we had, um, you know, Robert Fulton and James Watt looking at the steam engine, and Watt adapts it for use in factories. And then you have these workers, and they're coming from the poorer classes, and what they have is very little. And they would have to work up to 16 hours a day, and they'd get little pay. And children, even as young as 5, would be put to work. And what's even worse is that because they were living in poor conditions, you had a rampant amount of uh, death due to poor eating habits, poor food production in some of these areas, overcrowding. You'd have a family have 4, 5, 6 children, and they would share a room with other families. It was just nuts. Sewage used to flow in the streets. We didn't have sewer systems like we had today where it's underground. And factories, and even until the 70s and 80s, we had factories spewing all types of things into the air. It's only 30, 40 years ago, and they were doing it before they knew the effects. Back in the 1800s, they were doing it all over the place. Well, one of the items that started to evolve during the 1800s was the novel. Yes, about 15, 1600, you started seeing the novel. About 1650, the word novel comes out. Up until then, epic plays and dramas. But what you see is this evolution of the novel occurring. Miguel Cervantes was he produced Don Quixote. It was one of the first novels, and it was very good. It inspired a lot of authors. And authors would start to explore how they would tell their stories. And one of them was Charles Dickens. And he would use a third person, omniscient narrator, meaning, this narrator saw everything and reported on it. And it remains a popular style even today. Sir Walter Scott was another famous novelist, and he would make a claim that novels are fictional stories, but they do describe the lives of their characters. Charles Dickens, who was born the same year as Robert Browning, and that was in 1812, came from a family who was poor. His father didn't know what to do with money, spent it foolishly, ended up in a debtor's prison. By the time Dickens was 12 years old, he was without a father, and he was forced to live alone, and he worked with other children in the warehouses. He eventually was able to move up. He became a law clerk and a court reporter before he began his life as a novelist. Now, authors did not have a great reputation, and if you were marrying an author, many times people thought you were marrying down. And that was the case of Dickens' wife, Mary. Her father would not allow her to marry Dickens. Eventually he did marry someone else, Catherine Hogarth. You see, Mary Beadnell was Dickens' love of his life. But he was not truly happy, and eventually he would separate. He felt pain. He felt social injustice. And when you're able to feel these things, you're able to describe them in great detail. And instead of criticizing these injustices, he became involved to try to make these changes. He became a speaker. He would call attention to these injustices, and he did it probably the best way by writing about it in stories like Oliver Twist or A Christmas Carol, Tale of Two Cities, Great Expectations, David Copperfield, among others. You'll have a chance to read Oliver Twist and about his trials and tribulations. And in Oliver Twist, Dickens tells us about the physical and social degradation of urban Britain during the Industrial Revolution. The streets are filled with filth. People are walking around with lots of hunger and helpless. And if you could find a halfway decent place to stay the night, you were lucky. In that plot of Oliver Twist, you'll learn how Oliver begins life as one of the many victims of a workhouse. In some ways, it is what Dickens has gone through. But it changes. And you'll hear about how Oliver Twist was beaten up, how he runs away, and how he finally finds a protector and a benefactor in Mr. Brownlow. But what ends up happening is he is abducted and ends up being wounded and left for dead in a ditch. There's a lot more that goes on, but I'll let you read it, because I'm not going to tell you everything that goes on. Come on. That would keep you on the edge of their seats, just like those newspaper serials back in the day. You do have some major characters, such as Fagin and Bill Sikes and Monks. Mr. Brownlow, who happens to be the first character to really look out after Oliver. And you'll see the setting is where you have overcrowdedness and unsanitary conditions. Dickens will make certain that we see the clear contrast between urban settings and countryside settings in this story. The city seems doomed to corruption, while the countryside is your source of hope. In society, how do they treat the impoverished? Well, poverty is looked at as the reason why we have all the other problems in the city, such as hunger, homelessness, crime. And Dickens will look at how the upper and middle class are obsessed with this idea. And then he brings to life the ideas of child labor and the abuse of children. Children were helpless. And if they continue to live this life, what would happen to them as adults? There's a lot of good and evil that occurs in Oliver Twist. And I know you're going to enjoy it. In Oliver Twist, you also see a good use of satire. You also see a preoccupation with class. You know, the idea of class not being good enough. If you're in the middle class, you didn't date an upper class person. You did not move upwards in society. Because what you were born into is usually the tag you continued with. And in Oliver Twist, you'll see Dickens from time to time give us great details about the conditions that these people lived in, including the way their houses looked. What was their neighborhoods all about? He sympathized with the poor, and his writing shows this. And he wants us to understand what the Industrial Revolution did to society. You know, Charles Dickens will use different characters to launch a critique of the social conditions that are in England. He illustrates that the poor themselves can be cruel towards those who are even less poor. Oliver Twist. Pretty unique story. If you've loved The Christmas Carol, or if you like The Christmas Carol, I assure you, you're going to love Oliver Twist even more. So there you have it. We took a look about using a keyword main idea graphic organizer where we could summarize our information in one sentence. We took another look at the Victorian era. The many great writers, including Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Robert Browning, Matthew Arnold, and of course the famous novelists of the day, Oscar Wilde, Charles Dickens, briefly, and the Bronte sisters. And then we took a little bit longer look at Charles Dickens before we wrapped it up for the week. Next week, we'll take a look at one of those Bronte sisters. We're going to look at Emily. We're also going to take a look at Victorian drama, as drama becomes or comes into the modern age during this time frame. And then we'll wrap it up with a brief discussion about the activity for the week. And so, until next time, I'd like to remind you to keep on working smarter, not harder. Until then, have yourself a great day.
That might sound boring, but I think the boring stuff is the stuff I remember the most.